On our fifth anniversary night, my father-in-law humiliated me in front of 550 elite guests. He called me a charity case with a worthless mechanic father. When I finally stood up for myself and exposed his massive tax fraud, my husband slapped me across the face while the entire ballroom watched. I did not cry. I just wiped the blood from my lip and made one phone call to the man they thought was a grease monkey. "Dad," I said, "please come and destroy them." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach arrogant people a lesson they will never forget. My name is Stella, and I am 33 years old. For the past 5 years, I have been married to Harrison, the vice president of a prominent commercial real estate firm in New York City. From the outside, my life looked like a modern fairy tale. I was the ordinary girl who married into a family of extraordinary wealth. But behind the heavy oak doors of their Manhattan penthouse, I was treated like a parasite. My father-in-law Winston was a ruthless conservative real estate mogul who demanded absolute worship. He hated me from the moment Harrison brought me home. He hated my simple clothes. He hated that I drove a used sedan. Most of all, he hated my father Alexander, a man who preferred to wear stained flannel shirts and tinker with old truck engines. Winston thought we were poor, uneducated trash looking for a handout. They had absolutely no idea that my father was actually a private equity titan on Wall Street. They did not know that my father controlled billions of dollars in assets, preferring to live entirely off the grid to avoid the toxic superficiality of high society. And they certainly did not know that I was the sole heir to a massive trust fund. I hid my wealth because I wanted a marriage built on genuine love, not financial strategy. I wanted to be valued for my mind and my character. Instead, I spent 5 years being emotionally abused by a family of fragile narcissists who measured human worth strictly by designer labels and country club memberships. Tonight was the breaking point. We were seated at the head table in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. 550 of the city's most influential investors, politicians, and socialites were gathered under the sparkling crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white tuxedos poured expensive vintage champagne into our glasses. The event was a dual celebration marking the 30th anniversary of Winston's company and my 5th wedding anniversary with Harrison. I sat quietly in my understated black evening gown, staring at the perfectly folded linen napkin on my lap. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating. My husband Harrison sat right beside me, completely ignoring my presence. He was busy laughing loudly at a mean-spirited joke made by his younger sister, Caroline. Caroline wore a diamond necklace that cost more than most people earn in a decade. I knew for a fact that she purchased that necklace using company funds that were supposed to be allocated for employee health care benefits. I knew this because I was the one who had to fix the accounting error. For the past 5 years, I had been working anonymously as a senior financial risk analyst through a third-party consulting firm. Winston and Harrison were completely unaware that the brilliant analyst they hired to clean up their catastrophic financial messes was actually their despised daughter-in-law. I was the one who worked 80-hour weeks fixing their illegal commercial zoning violations. I restructured their toxic debt so they could keep living their lavish lifestyle. They treated me like garbage at the family dinner table, completely blind to the fact that my financial models were the only reason they were not currently sitting in a federal prison for tax evasion. The clinking of a silver spoon against a crystal flute echoed through the massive ballroom. The chatter of the elite crowd died down instantly. Winston stood at the podium looking like a king addressing his loyal subjects. At 62 years old, he radiated arrogant authority. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and leaned into the microphone. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Winston began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Tonight we celebrate the unmatched success of our real estate empire, but we also celebrate my son Harrison. 5 years ago, Harrison performed a tremendous act of charity. My stomach tightened into a painful knot. I knew exactly what he was doing." Winston looked directly at me with a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. Harrison married Stella Winston continued, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. A girl burdened with mountains of student loans. A girl raised by a lowly mechanic who probably spends his days covered in cheap motor oil. Harrison brought her into our world of privilege. He gave her a luxurious life she could never have imagined in her wildest dreams. Let us applaud my son for his incredible generosity to the less fortunate. A wave of polite but cruel laughter rippled through the ballroom. Caroline let out a sharp, piercing giggle from across our table. Harrison puffed out his chest and smiled proudly, as if he had just rescued a stray dog from the gutter. He did not look at me. He did not defend his wife. He simply soaked up the toxic praise. I sat frozen in my chair. The humiliation burned my cheeks, but the anger burning in my chest was infinitely hotter. I looked around the room at the hundreds of wealthy faces staring at me with pity and amusement. I thought about the late nights I spent crying in our bathroom while Harrison belittled my career. I thought about the panic attacks I suffered while trying to untangle Winston's fraudulent ledgers just to keep the family business afloat. I had sacrificed my own peace to protect people who viewed me as nothing more than a punchline. Winston raised his champagne glass high into the air. To our flawless business acumen, he declared loudly, to the untouchable legacy of our family name. That was the moment the scared, accommodating wife died. That was the moment I decided to burn their fake empire to the ground. I pushed my chair back. The heavy wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. The sound cut sharply through the polite applause. I stood up slowly and picked up my champagne glass. Every single eye in the room turned toward me. Harrison grabbed my wrist under the table, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. "Sit down and shut up," Harrison hissed through gritted teeth. "You are embarrassing me." I yanked my arm out of his violent grasp. I looked straight at Winston on the stage. My voice was calm, incredibly clear, and completely devoid of fear. It carried perfectly across the dead silent ballroom. "Flawless business acumen, Winston," I asked brightly. Winston's confident smile vanished instantly. His face turned a dangerous, blotchy shade of red. "What are you doing?" he barked into the microphone. "Sit down immediately." I took a step away from the table, ensuring everyone could see me clearly. "Is that what we are calling the $12 million tax discrepancy I had to bury for you last month?" I asked, raising my voice so the wealthy investors in the front row could hear every single word. "Is that what we call the offshore shell accounts you used to hide your massive losses from the very people sitting in this room tonight? Because if it were not for the risk analyst you hired to fix your fraudulent ledgers, federal investigators would be seizing this hotel right now instead of serving you a luxury dinner." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Elite investors began whispering frantically to each other. Some pulled out their phones, likely messaging their financial advisors. Caroline dropped her wineglass, shattering it on the table in pure shock. Winston stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing in silent horror. He recognized the exact financial figures I was quoting. The terrifying realization hit him like a freight train. The anonymous corporate consultant who knew all his filthy secrets was the daughter-in-law he had just publicly humiliated. The heavy silence that followed my words was suffocating. I watched Winston grip the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified old man rather than a powerful real estate mogul. He leaned away from the microphone, breathing heavily, unable to form a single coherent sentence. He knew I was telling the absolute truth. He knew the exact $12 million figure I had spoken aloud. He knew the offshore accounts were real. The elite investors sitting at the front tables immediately understood the gravity of my statement. Men in expensive suits began loosening their ties and urgently whispering to their associates. Wives clutched their pearl necklaces, exchanging panicked glances. The pristine image of Winston's invincible corporate empire was shattering into a million pieces right before their eyes. Harrison suddenly realized the catastrophic damage unfolding around him. His entire inheritance and his fragile ego were being destroyed by the woman he considered nothing more than a quiet, obedient accessory. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed to the marble floor. He stormed away from the head table, his heavy footsteps echoing in the massive ballroom. He marched directly toward me with his fists clenched at his sides. I stood my ground, holding my head high and refusing to look away. I had spent 5 years shrinking myself to make him feel large. I was absolutely done shrinking. Harrison grabbed my shoulder, squeezing my collarbone with enough force to leave bruises. He spun me around to face him. He looked wildly around the room, trying to salvage his precious reputation. He forced a strained, terrible smile aimed at the investors. "Please excuse my wife, everyone," Harrison shouted desperately over the rising murmur of the crowd. "She has been struggling with severe mental health issues lately. She is having a hysterical episode. She does not know what she is saying. We will get her the medical help she clearly needs." I pulled my shoulder out of his aggressive grip. I looked him dead in the eye. "I am not hysterical, Harrison," I said calmly. "I am the anonymous senior analyst your father hired to save this sinking ship. I have every single financial document saved on a secure server. I have the emails. I have the forged signature logs. The federal authorities will find them very interesting." The reality of my words destroyed whatever remaining sanity Harrison had left. The realization that his submissive wife was actually the financial genius who had been secretly saving his incompetent family sent him over the edge. He lost total control. Harrison raised his right hand high into the air. He swung his arm down with brutal, terrifying force. His heavy palm struck the left side of my face. The sickening sound of flesh hitting flesh echoed loudly through the ballroom. The sheer violence of the blow threw me entirely off balance. My vision flashed bright white. I stumbled backward and crashed hard onto my knees against the cold marble floor. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting up my legs, but the burning sting on my cheek was infinitely worse. My ears rang loudly from the sudden strike. The entire ballroom of 550 guests fell dead silent. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. The waiters froze in their tracks, holding trays of expensive caviar. For one brief second, I thought someone might step forward to help me. I thought surely someone in this room full of supposedly civilized, educated people would condemn a man for striking his wife in public. I was entirely wrong. Instead of outrage, the silence was quickly broken by cruel, judgmental whispers directed entirely at me. The wealthy socialites and arrogant businessmen began murmuring behind their hands. I heard a woman at the next table whisper that I completely deserved it for humiliating my husband. An older man muttered that working-class girls simply do not know how to behave in polite society. Caroline let out an audible sigh of disgust, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes at my figure on the floor. They were not horrified by his violence. They were horrified by my disobedience. In their twisted, privileged world, a husband hitting his wife was perfectly acceptable if she dared to challenge his authority. Harrison stood towering over me, breathing heavily like a wild animal. His chest heaved up and down in his tailored tuxedo. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice dripped with absolute venom and superiority. "You are completely crazy," Harrison hissed, his words carrying across the quiet room. "How dare you bite the hand that feeds you? If it were not for this family and our money, you would be absolutely nothing. You and your pathetic grease monkey father would be starving under a bridge right now. You are a charity case, Stella. You are just a poor mechanic's daughter who got lucky. We gave you everything, and you ruined it." I knelt on the cold floor listening to his arrogant tirade. I felt a warm metallic liquid pooling inside my mouth. I slowly raised my hand and touched the corner of my lips. My fingers came away stained with bright red blood. Harrison had hit me hard enough to split my lip open. I looked at the blood on my fingers. Then I looked up at the man I had promised to spend my life with. For 5 years I had tried to see the good in him. I had tried to believe he was just misguided or pressured by his terrible father. But seeing him stand there basking in his own cruel violence, I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. The love was entirely gone. The obligation was gone. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg for his forgiveness. I wiped the blood from my mouth using the back of my hand. I stood up slowly, deliberately, taking my time. I smoothed the fabric of my black evening gown. I raised my chin and locked my gaze with his. My eyes were dead and cold. I looked at Harrison not as my husband, but as a corpse. I looked at him like he was a bug waiting to be crushed under a heavy boot. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered slightly when he saw the absolute lack of fear in my expression. I reached into my small evening clutch. I bypassed the tissues and the lipstick. I pulled out my phone. It was time to introduce Harrison and his miserable family to the mechanic they thought was so pathetic. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you strike the sole heir of a Wall Street titan. I unlocked my phone screen and tapped the only contact I needed right now. The name Dad glowed brightly against the harsh, sophisticated lighting of the grand ballroom. I raised the phone to my ear. The line rang exactly once before his deep, familiar voice answered the call. "Dad," I said. My voice was completely steady and entirely empty of the tears that everyone in this room expected me to shed. "Come pick me up, and get ready to pull the net." I pressed end before he could reply. He did not need to ask any questions. He already knew exactly what those words meant. We had prepared for this exact contingency for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Harrison burst into a loud theatrical laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. He pointed a finger at me and looked around at the wealthy investors, ensuring they were all paying attention to his impromptu comedy show. "Did you hear that, everyone?" Harrison shouted, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "She just called her daddy. What is he going to do, Stella? Is he going to drive his rusted-out 1998 pickup truck to the front entrance of the Ritz-Carlton? Is he going to fix my transmission in the valet line to teach me a lesson? Maybe he can change my oil while he is begging me to take his crazy daughter back." A few sycophantic business partners chuckled at his terrible joke. But before Harrison could continue his arrogant tirade, I felt a strong, steady hand gently grip my elbow. I turned my head and saw Donovan. Donovan was Caroline's husband. He was a brilliantly talented cardiothoracic surgeon and an African-American man who had fought tooth and nail for every single thing he had achieved in this world. He was also the only person in this room of 550 elites who actually possessed a working moral compass. He stepped squarely between me and Harrison, using his tall, athletic frame to completely block my husband's line of sight. "Are you okay?" Stella Donovan asked quietly. His dark, intelligent eyes scanned my split lip with professional medical concern, ignoring the chaotic noise of the room. Harrison's face turned a violent shade of purple at the sight of someone daring to intervene. He stepped aggressively toward Donovan, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "Back off, Donovan." Harrison spat. "This is family business. Do not interfere with my wife, you pathetic freeloader. You should be fetching my drinks, not standing in my way. You are lucky we even let you sit at the main table tonight." Donovan did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, towering over Harrison with an effortless, intimidating authority. The arrogant smirk vanished from Harrison's face as Donovan took one slow, deliberate step closer, forcing my husband to take an awkward step back. The racial and class prejudices this family held against Donovan were a poorly kept secret. They smiled at him in public to project a progressive liberal image, but they mocked his working-class Detroit roots in private. They resented him deeply because he was black, self-made, and infinitely more successful than they would ever be without crawling back to Daddy's bank account. Freeloader, Donovan repeated. His voice was dangerously low, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that sliced right through the heavy tension of the ballroom. "Let us get something perfectly straight right now, Harrison." Caroline gasped from her seat, sensing what was coming. "The only reason your sister can afford to parade around in that diamond necklace tonight is because I work 60-hour shifts in the operating room," Donovan stated, his words ringing out with absolute clarity. "My surgeon's salary pays the mortgage on that sprawling mansion she pretends she bought. My money covers her luxury car leases and her daily designer shopping sprees because her precious trust fund dried up 3 years ago. Do not ever speak to me about freeloading while your entire family survives on my hard work and Stella's financial genius. Now get out of my way before I forget my medical oath and break your jaw. The entire ballroom collectively gasped. Caroline buried her face in her hands, utterly humiliated, as the truth of her financial dependence was laid bare before the city's most vicious gossips. Winston looked like he might actually have a heart attack right there on the stage. Donovan understood my pain intimately because he lived it every single day in their toxic household. He knew exactly what it felt like to be used and discarded by these narcissistic monsters. I looked at Donovan and gave him a slow, genuine nod of profound gratitude. "Thank you, Donovan," I said softly. "But I can walk out of here myself. Take care of yourself. Do not let them drag you down with them." I turned my back on Harrison. I turned my back on Winston and Caroline and every single judgmental socialite in that suffocating room. I walked toward the grand exit doors with my head held high. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. No one dared to stop me. The security guards parted like the Red Sea as I pushed through the heavy brass doors, leaving the dead silence of the ballroom behind me. I walked out into the cool, crisp New York night air. The valet attendants were scrambling around the front drive. I heard the hotel doors swing open behind me. Harrison had followed me out to the main lobby, clearly unable to let me have the last word. He stood near the revolving glass doors, watching me wait on the curb. "Go ahead and run," Harrison yelled down the steps. "You will be crawling back to me begging for bus fare by tomorrow morning. Nobody else is going to want a broken, damaged liability like you." I did not even bother to turn around. I ignored him entirely, keeping my eyes focused on the street ahead. Less than 2 minutes later, the low, intimidating rumble of a massive engine echoed down the avenue. It was definitely not a rusted pickup truck. A pristine, midnight black armored Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly up the hotel driveway and stopped exactly in front of me. 4 massive men in dark tailored suits equipped with earpieces stepped out of the vehicle with terrifying military precision. They immediately formed a protective perimeter around me, physically blocking the valet staff and anyone else from approaching. One of the imposing guards opened the heavy armored rear door and bowed his head respectfully, waiting for me to enter. I stepped into the luxurious leather interior without casting a single glance backward. Through the tinted bulletproof glass, I could see Harrison standing completely frozen on the hotel steps. His jaw was practically touching the concrete. But even in the face of undeniable reality, his massive ego refused to accept the truth. I watched him marching up to the valet captain, aggressively pointing his finger at the departing Rolls-Royce. He was frantically convincing himself that I had simply thrown a dramatic tantrum and used his Platinum Company credit card to order a premium VIP car service just to spite him. He had absolutely no idea that the car belonged to the man he had just publicly humiliated as a grease monkey. He had no idea that the net was already closing in tightly around his throat. The morning sun filtered brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my hidden Tribeca penthouse. This sprawling property was held securely under a blind trust. Harrison had absolutely no idea it even existed. I stood in the center of the massive marble kitchen, pouring a fresh cup of black coffee. The left side of my face throbbed with a dull, heavy ache from the sheer force of his physical assault last night. But despite the bruising on my skin, my mind was sharper and colder than it had ever been. My phone sat on the kitchen island, vibrating relentlessly against the polished granite countertop. It had been ringing and buzzing without a single pause since 6 o'clock in the morning. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark coffee and finally picked up the device. The screen was completely flooded with aggressive notifications. There were 42 missed calls and over 60 text messages. Almost all of them were from Harrison. I unlocked the screen and opened his message thread. His texts were a frantic, pathetic mix of arrogant gloating and vicious threats. He was desperately trying to reassert his dominance after I shattered his fragile ego in front of the city's financial elite. "You are completely finished, Stella," the first message read. "I called the bank the second they opened their doors today. Every single joint, checking, and savings account is entirely frozen. Your name has been permanently removed from everything we own. The next text arrived just a minute later. I canceled all your credit cards. Do not even try to use the platinum card for a hotel room. It will decline and you will look like the broke trash you truly are. I also called the building concierge. Your key fob is permanently deactivated. I told the security staff to pack your pathetic cheap clothes into black garbage bags and throw them out in the service alley where they belong. He was practically foaming at the mouth through the digital screen. You thought you could humiliate my father and get away with it. You have absolutely nothing without my last name. Good luck surviving on the streets. You better start looking for a waitress job today because you are getting nothing from me. Before I could even process his pathetic attempts at financial intimidation, a new message popped up on the screen. This one was from Caroline. She had clearly been briefed by her brother and eagerly wanted to join the firing squad. I hope you kept your old mop and bucket. Caroline texted, her words dripping with typical suburban elitism. It is time for you to go back to scrubbing toilets to pay off those massive student loans you dragged into this family. Do not even dream of getting a single cent from our family fortune in the divorce. We are going to bury you in expensive legal fees until you are totally bankrupt. You are dead to us, you pathetic gold digger. I read her message twice and let out a soft, genuine laugh. The absolute sheer delusion of this family was almost a masterpiece of human ignorance. They were so deeply obsessed with their own perceived superiority that they could not see the massive tidal wave coming right for them. Caroline thought I was a desperate gold digger trying to steal her father's money. She had no idea her precious father was currently drowning in $300 million of highly toxic debt. She had no idea that the suffocating student loans they constantly mocked me for were a complete fabrication. 5 years ago, when I first met Harrison, I wanted to know if he loved me for my character or if he was just another Wall Street vulture looking for a wealthy heiress to merge assets with. I created a fake background. I told him I was a middle-class girl paying off a mountain of college debt. He failed the character test miserably, but I was young and foolishly in love. I ignored the massive, glaring red flags because I desperately wanted to build a normal, happy life away from my father's intense corporate shadow. Now their frantic efforts to protect their crumbling real estate empire from my supposedly greedy hands were the funniest thing I had ever witnessed. Harrison honestly believed he was leaving me destitute by cutting off a joint account that held a measly $200,000. He thought he was stripping me of my power by canceling a credit card. I set my coffee mug down heavily on the kitchen island. I opened the keyboard on my phone. I did not write a long emotional paragraph explaining how much his violence and betrayal had hurt me. I did not beg for access to the townhouse just to get my belongings. I did not argue with Caroline about my inherent worth. I simply typed one single character and hit send. I sent Harrison a thumbs up emoji. That was it. One simple cheerful thumbs up to acknowledge his frantic, desperate rant. I knew that a total lack of emotional reaction would drive his narcissistic brain absolutely insane. He wanted me to cry and plead for his mercy. Giving him zero energy was the ultimate insult to his massive ego. I tossed the phone onto the sofa and walked down the wide hallway toward the master bedroom. I stepped into the massive walk-in closet and pressed my hand against a hidden panel in the custom oak cabinetry. A biometric scanner immediately glowed bright blue. I placed my thumb flat on the glass surface. The heavy steel door of my hidden wall safe clicked open with a quiet, mechanical hum. Inside the dark safe, resting securely on top of a stack of encrypted hard drives and valuable corporate bonds, was a thick, manila envelope. I pulled it out and untied the string closure. I slid the heavy legal document into my hands. The pristine white pages were tightly bound by a dark blue spine originating from one of the most ruthless family law firms in Manhattan. It was the prenuptial agreement. 5 years ago, Winston had practically thrown this exact document at my face across his imposing mahogany desk. He had threatened to cancel the wedding and completely disown Harrison if I refused to sign it immediately. Winston was terrified that a poor girl like me would eventually divorce his son and walk away with half of his precious real estate company. He demanded the most ironclad, restrictive prenuptial agreement legally possible in the state of New York. The terms were brutally simple. What is yours, and what is mine is mine. Total and complete separation of all assets acquired before the marriage. No spousal support under any circumstances. In the event of a divorce, each party walks away with exactly what they brought into the union. Harrison had signed it with a smug grin, thinking he was brilliantly protecting his millions from a penniless bride. I ran my fingers over Winston's aggressive scrawling signature at the bottom of the final page. I smiled as I felt the deep, indented ink on the paper. Winston thought he had built an impenetrable fortress to keep me out. He had no idea he had actually handed me a flawless, impenetrable shield to protect my own $2 billion trust fund from his greedy, incompetent son. They wanted me to leave with exactly what I brought into this marriage. I was more than happy to oblige. The elevator doors opened silently to the top floor of the most ruthless family law firm in Manhattan. The air up here smelled of polished mahogany and quiet, absolute power. I walked past the reception desk where the assistant immediately stood up to guide me into the corner office. Bradley was already waiting for me. He was the kind of legal shark who charged $1,000 an hour and never lost a case. He represented billionaires, tech moguls, and old money dynasties. Today, he was representing me against the very family that thought I was completely destitute. I sat down in the leather chair across from his massive desk and tossed the thick manila envelope containing the prenuptial agreement onto the glass surface. Bradley did not reach for it immediately. Instead, he turned his computer monitor toward me with a highly amused expression on his sharp face. "You have a very vocal husband," Stella Bradley said, adjusting his expensive silver-framed glasses. "He has been sending emails to my general firm inbox all morning. It seems he hired a budget attorney to draft a demand letter. He is insisting on a full forensic audit of your non-existent bank accounts and demanding immediate division of what he calls marital assets." Bradley began reading the email aloud. The aggressive, desperate tone of Harrison's words echoed through the spacious office. Harrison claimed I had maliciously manipulated his family. He demanded I surrender half of any savings I had managed to scrape together during our 5-year marriage. He even threatened to sue me for emotional distress and publicly ruin my professional reputation if I did not sign a completely one-sided divorce settlement by the end of the week. When Bradley finished reading the pathetic list of demands, he actually threw his head back and laughed out loud. It was a rich, booming sound of pure disbelief. I joined him, letting a cold smile spread across my face. The sheer audacity of Harrison demanding money from me while his own company was drowning in $300 million of toxic debt was the greatest comedy I had ever witnessed. "Let him dream," Bradley chuckled, wiping a tear of amusement from his eye. "Let him hire every budget lawyer in the city, because the document you just placed on my desk is the most beautiful piece of legal self-sabotage I have ever seen in my 30 years of practice." Bradley picked up the prenuptial agreement and flipped to the final pages. We had reviewed this document extensively before I married Harrison. 5 years ago, Winston had trapped me in his suffocating home office. He had slammed this exact contract onto the table and demanded my signature. Winston was so terrified that a poor girl from a mechanic father would steal his precious real estate empire that he paid his lawyers a fortune to draft the most restrictive terms legally possible in the state of New York. The clauses were brutal and absolutely unforgiving. The agreement stated that all assets acquired prior to the marriage remained the sole and exclusive property of the original owner. It explicitly waived any right to spousal support alimony or asset division, regardless of the length of the marriage. It dictated that in the event of a divorce, neither party could touch a single penny of the other person's wealth. What is yours, and what is mine is mine. Total, absolute financial separation. Winston had forced me to sign it with a triumphant sneer, thinking he was brilliantly protecting his family from a greedy gold digger. He had absolutely no idea that he was actually building an impenetrable fortress around my own wealth. Harrison and Winston only knew my father as a working-class mechanic. They did not know that my late mother was the heiress to a massive shipping and logistics empire. When she passed away, she left everything entirely to me in an ironclad trust fund. I had access to a fortune currently valued at $2 billion. I hid this wealth deliberately because I wanted to be loved for who I was, not what I possessed. I wanted a normal life free from the toxic superficiality that destroyed so many wealthy families. By forcing me to sign that predatory prenuptial agreement, Winston had legally blocked his own son from touching a single cent of my $2 billion inheritance. If we had married without a prenuptial agreement, Harrison might have had grounds to claim the marital appreciation of my assets. He could have dragged me through years of agonizing litigation. But Winston's overwhelming greed and prejudice had ironically shielded me entirely. The very weapon they designed to leave me destitute on the streets was now the exact instrument protecting my massive fortune from their greedy, desperate hands. "I want you to draft the countersuit today, Bradley," I instructed, leaning back in my chair. "Do not ask for a single penny from him. I want the divorce finalized exactly as the prenuptial agreement dictates. Give Harrison exactly what his father demanded 5 years ago. He leaves with his assets and I leave with mine." Bradley smiled a predatory grin that promised absolute destruction. "I will have the filings submitted to the court before noon," he confirmed, typing rapidly on his keyboard. "His lawyer will receive our response by the end of the business day." I would pay good money to see the look on Harrison's face when he realizes his threats are legally useless against a contract drafted by his own father. The legal battle regarding the divorce was effectively over before it even began. But the financial war was just entering its most critical phase. The divorce was merely a personal cleanup. The real punishment was going to hit them where it truly hurt: their social status and their corporate empire. I pulled out my secure tablet and opened the encrypted communication channel to my father's Wall Street acquisition team. We had been monitoring Winston's failing commercial real estate company for months. The $12 million tax discrepancy I had exposed last night at the Ritz-Carlton was just the tip of the iceberg. Their company was bleeding cash and default notices were piling up on their desk. They were desperately searching for a private equity firm to bail them out of a catastrophic $300 million hole. I dialed the direct line to the lead acquisition manager at my father's firm. The call connected instantly. "Accelerate the timeline." I ordered my voice, leaving no room for hesitation. "Winston is going to be panicking after last night. He will be desperate for any lifeline to save his company from immediate foreclosure. I want our firm to be the only one offering to buy that debt. Make sure every other bank in the city denies their loan applications. Corner them completely." "Consider it done," the manager replied professionally. "We have already initiated the debt purchase from their primary lenders. By tomorrow morning, we will hold the exclusive rights to their $300 million debt portfolio. We will be their sole creditor." I ended the call and looked out the massive windows at the Manhattan skyline. Harrison thought he could slap me in front of 500 people and face zero consequences. Winston thought he could humiliate my father and retain his power. They were about to learn a devastating lesson about true wealth. I was not just going to leave Harrison. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire reality and serve it to him on a silver platter. The glass doors of the towering Manhattan skyscraper parted as I stepped into the sprawling corporate lobby of my father-in-law's real estate firm. For 5 years, I had walked through these very doors, suffocating in rigid business suits and keeping my head down. Today, I wore a simple cream cashmere sweater and a pair of perfectly tailored dark jeans. I was not here to work. I was here on a surgical strike to retrieve one single item: a heavily encrypted personal USB drive I had left taped under my former desk. That small drive contained the final pieces of their fraudulent accounting puzzles. I needed it to complete my father's acquisition portfolio. The massive marble lobby was bustling with mid-morning corporate traffic. As I walked past the reception desk, I noticed the immediate shift in the atmosphere. Whispers erupted like wildfire among the junior executives and administrative staff. Word of the disastrous anniversary gala had clearly spread through the company grapevine. People stared at my casual clothing and bruised cheek, assuming I was a defeated woman coming to beg for her job back. I ignored their staring and kept my eyes fixed on the executive elevator bank. Before I could even reach the security turnstiles, the polished silver doors of the main elevator slid open. Harrison stepped out into the lobby. He was not alone. His arm was wrapped tightly and possessively around the waist of his lead executive secretary. Her name was Vanessa. She was a woman who had spent the last 2 years glaring at me during office holiday parties. Now she was practically draped over my husband in the middle of a busy professional setting. They were parading their infidelity, openly eager to prove to the world that Harrison was already moving on to someone supposedly better. Harrison spotted me approaching the security desk. His arrogant smirk instantly widened into a malicious grin. He let go of Vanessa just long enough to point a condescending finger in my direction, ensuring everyone in the lobby was paying attention to his impromptu performance. "Look who decided to crawl back," Harrison announced, his voice booming obnoxiously across the marble floor. "I told you she would not last a single night on the streets, Vanessa. Look at her. She could not even afford to put on a decent suit today. Are you here to pack up your cheap office supplies, Stella? Make sure you grab some cardboard boxes from the loading dock. You're going to need them when you move under the Brooklyn Bridge tonight." Vanessa let out a high-pitched, grating laugh that echoed annoyingly against the glass walls. She leaned closer to Harrison, pressing herself against his tailored suit jacket. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "I told security to throw your garbage out this morning," Vanessa sneered, stepping slightly forward to establish her new dominance. "But Harrison is far too generous. He said we should let you carry your own trash out of the building so you can feel the full weight of your failure. It is truly pathetic, Stella. You actually thought you could ruin his family and walk away with their money. Now you are just a homeless nobody." I stood perfectly still, watching their theatrical display of cruelty. I felt absolutely zero jealousy or heartbreak seeing my husband holding another woman. Instead, a deep, overwhelming wave of pity washed over me. They were acting like triumphant conquerors standing on the deck of a sinking ship. Vanessa aggressively reached up to adjust Harrison's lapel. As she made the exaggerated movement, the bright lobby lights caught the heavy sparkling metal on her left wrist. It was a brand-new diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. The piece easily retailed for $40,000. She noticed my eyes dropping to her wrist and immediately thrust her arm forward to make sure I got a clear, unobstructed view of the jewelry. "Do you like it?" Vanessa bragged, her voice dripping with toxic vanity. "Harrison bought it for me this morning to celebrate his newfound freedom. He said a real executive needs a real woman by his side, not a charity case who wears discount store rags." I looked at the glittering Cartier watch and let out a slow, genuine smile. The sheer stupidity of my husband was a marvel of human nature. I knew exactly how Harrison operated. He did not have $40,000 of liquid cash sitting in his personal checking account. He had undoubtedly purchased that extravagant watch using his corporate executive credit card. The same corporate credit card that was tied directly to the commercial accounts I had been secretly monitoring for months. Harrison puffed out his chest, misinterpreting my smile for quiet devastation. "Go ahead and cry, Stella," he taunted, stepping closer to the security barrier. "You are looking at the life you could have kept if you just knew how to keep your mouth shut and respect your betters. Now grab your pathetic little desk items and get out of my building before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults at Vanessa or cry about his infidelity. I simply reached into my pocket and pulled out my black biometric access card. It was a specialized master key that Winston had given to his top-tier risk analysts, a key Harrison did not even know existed. I tapped the card against the restricted scanner of the private executive elevator. The light immediately flashed green, and the glass security barriers parted smoothly for me. Harrison frowned, his arrogant expression faltering as he realized my access had not been revoked. "How the hell is your card still active?" he demanded, his voice losing its confident edge. "I told them to wipe your profile from the system." I stepped past the barriers and pressed the button for the private lift. The silver doors immediately began to open. I turned around to face my husband and his new mistress one final time. I looked directly at the sparkling diamonds wrapped around Vanessa's wrist. "You really should hold on to that watch tightly, Vanessa," I said, my voice calm, clear, and echoing with absolute finality. "It is a beautiful piece. And since he definitely bought it using his corporate expense account this morning, you should probably cherish it. It is literally the only thing the bank will not seize from him by next week." Harrison's face drained of color as the mathematical reality of my words hit his pathetic brain. He opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the heavy silver doors of the private elevator slid shut, completely cutting off his voice. I stood in the quiet hum of the ascending lift, heading straight for my desk to retrieve the final nail in their corporate coffin. I stepped off the private elevator and walked briskly down the silent executive corridor. Nobody dared to stop me or even make eye contact. I reached my old cubicle, the isolated corner they deliberately assigned me to keep me hidden from their prestigious board members. I knelt down on the carpet and ran my hand along the underside of the heavy wooden desk. My fingers brushed against a small piece of industrial tape. I ripped it away with one swift motion, freeing the encrypted flash drive I had hidden there months ago. This tiny piece of metal held the complete unredacted transaction logs. It contained the exact routing numbers of the offshore accounts Winston used to hide his failing investments. It proved every single instance of corporate fraud Harrison had committed to fund his lavish lifestyle and his mistresses. I dropped the drive into my coat pocket. My mission in this toxic building was officially over. I did not take the main lobby exit. I had zero interest in seeing Harrison or his new mistress again today. Instead, I used my master keycard to access the secure maintenance corridor. This concrete hallway connected directly to the adjacent commercial high-rise. It was a massive tower that my family's trust actually owned, a fact Winston would have wept to discover. I took the designated freight elevator straight up to the rooftop. The biting winter wind whipped my hair violently around my face as the heavy steel doors slid open. A sleek, matte black helicopter sat idling on the private helipad, its massive rotors slicing loudly through the cold morning air. The pilot gave me a sharp professional nod as I climbed inside and strapped myself securely into the leather seat. Within seconds, we lifted off the ground, leaving the pathetic, crumbling empire of my husband far below in the concrete canyon. I looked out the window and watched the Manhattan skyline stretch out before me like a vast chessboard. The adrenaline from the morning encounter was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I was no longer the submissive wife trying to salvage a broken man. I was a predator returning to my natural habitat. We were flying straight toward the financial heart of the world. Wall Street. The helicopter banked sharply to the right and descended toward a monolithic glass skyscraper that dominated the southern tip of the island. This imposing tower was the headquarters of my father's private equity firm. It was a ruthless company that specialized in swallowing failing businesses, whole, stripping their assets, restructuring their management, and selling their remains for massive, unimaginable profits. The helicopter landing skids touched down smoothly on the rooftop. Two armed security contractors immediately stepped forward to escort me from the helipad to the private executive elevator. The doors slid shut, and we dropped rapidly down to the penthouse level. I walked into the sprawling executive suite. The entire far wall was constructed of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Statue of Liberty and the harbor. Sitting behind an imposing desk, carved from a single solid slab of petrified wood, was my father, Alexander. If Harrison or Winston had walked into this room right now, their fragile minds would have completely short-circuited. My father was widely recognized as the most feared and ruthless titan in the private equity sector. He controlled hundreds of billions of dollars in global assets. He had the power to bankrupt entire countries if he desired. Yet right now he was wearing faded gray sweatpants, a worn-out plaid flannel shirt, and a pair of scuffed brown work boots. He was happily eating a greasy double cheeseburger from a local street vendor, a stack of heavily redacted corporate takeover files sitting casually next to his fast food wrapper. This was the exact same outfit he had worn when he came to help me move into my first apartment 5 years ago. It was the exact same day Harrison and Winston first met him. Because my father had grease on his hands from checking my car engine and wore cheap, comfortable clothes, my arrogant in-laws had immediately labeled him a lowly mechanic. They were so blinded by their toxic classism and their desperate need to feel superior that they never bothered to run a simple background check on the man whose daughter was marrying into their family. If they had done even 5 minutes of basic financial research, they would have realized the mechanic they constantly mocked could buy their entire real estate portfolio with the loose change in his pocket. My father swallowed his bite of the burger and wiped his hands carefully on a paper napkin. He looked up at me with warm, welcoming eyes, his face breaking into a wide smile. But that warmth vanished into thin air the absolute second his gaze landed on the left side of my face. The red mark from Harrison's brutal slap had darkened and deepened into an ugly purple bruise along my cheekbone. The silence in the massive office became instantly heavy and terrifying. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. My father did not shout. He did not throw things across the room or curse loudly. The most dangerous men in the world never need to raise their voices to show their lethal intent. He simply leaned back in his expensive leather chair and stared at the physical evidence of my husband's violence. I could see the precise calculations happening behind his cold, calculating eyes. He was already planning their financial execution down to the very last cent. He reached slowly into his desk drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy confidential dossier. He tossed it onto the center of the wooden desk with a resounding thud. The bold red letters on the cover read, Debt Acquisition Protocol. He looked at me with eyes as cold as absolute zero. I told you not to get involved with those newly rich snobs, my father said, his voice vibrating with lethal authority. The handprint on your face, I will make them pay with their entire empire. I pulled the encrypted flash drive from my coat pocket and placed it squarely on the center of his massive desk. This is the kill shot, I told him. Every altered ledger, every hidden account, every desperate maneuver they made over the past 5 years is right here on this drive. Alexander wiped the last bit of grease from his hands using a cloth napkin and plugged the small metal device into his secure terminal. The massive flat-screen monitors mounted on the wall flickered to life. Rows of complex financial data illuminated the dim penthouse office, casting a cold blue light across my father's sharp features. We stood side by side, analyzing the digital autopsy of my father-in-law's legacy. It was worse than even I had fully realized while working from the inside. Winston projected an image of invincible wealth to the Manhattan elite, but the foundation of his empire was built entirely on rotting wood and toxic lies. The screen displayed a cascading waterfall of red numbers. The grand total sat at the bottom of the master spreadsheet like a ticking time bomb. $300 million. That was the exact amount of highly leveraged bad debt hovering right over their heads, waiting to drop and crush them into dust. I pointed to a cluster of transactions routed through obscure offshore shell companies. That is Harrison's brilliant contribution to the family business. I explained, my voice steady and clinical. While Winston was busy attending charity galas and playing golf, Harrison fancied himself a visionary developer. He poured 9 figures into commercial developments that never actually broke ground. Ghost projects, empty lots in prime locations where he paid premium prices for building permits that expired years ago. He handed millions to fraudulent contractors who vanished into thin air. Instead of cutting their losses, they doubled down, taking out massive high-interest loans to cover the missing capital. They tried to build a skyscraper on a swamp of terrible decisions. Alexander let out a low, harsh laugh. His eyes scanned the digital rows, processing the monumental stupidity of the men who had dared to touch his daughter. He scrolled through the list of impending maturity dates. The primary loans were structured with brutal balloon payments, and the absolute final deadline was less than 72 hours away. Winston has been making frantic phone calls to every major bank in the city, Alexander said, leaning closer to the glowing screens. My associates told me he has been practically begging on his knees for a bridge loan. He is running around Wall Street looking for a white knight. He desperately needs a savior to sweep in and buy the debt to save them from immediate foreclosure. He knows that if he defaults by Friday, the banks will seize everything. The corporate headquarters, the residential properties, his personal penthouse, all of it will be auctioned off to the highest bidder to satisfy the creditors. I crossed my arms and stared at the staggering financial disaster unfolding on the monitors. Winston was absolutely desperate. He was hosting that ridiculous anniversary gala, not just to stroke his own ego, but to project an illusion of stability to potential investors. He needed the financial world to believe his company was thriving so he could secure a massive bailout. He was completely unaware that the only entity capable of swallowing a $300 million toxic debt portfolio was sitting right here in this room. Alexander turned his heavy leather chair to face me. His eyes were sharp and predatory, glowing with the thrill of the hunt. The banks holding these notes are terrified, he said. They know Winston is bleeding out. They want to offload this toxic debt before it destroys their own quarterly reports. If we move right now, we can buy these loans for pennies on the dollar. They will practically hand us the paperwork just to wash their hands of the mess and avoid the public relations nightmare of a high-profile default. I looked at the damning numbers flashing on the screen. I pictured Harrison slapping me across the face in front of 500 people. I pictured him standing in the lobby with his mistress sneering at me and telling me to go sleep under a bridge. I pictured Winston standing on that stage calling my father a worthless grease monkey and reducing my entire existence to a pathetic charity case. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of supreme power. It was time to show them what real power actually looked like. Do it, I commanded without a single ounce of hesitation. Buy every single one of those loans. I want our firm to hold the exclusive rights to their entire debt portfolio by the end of the business day. I want to own the very ground they walk on. Alexander smiled a terrifying, proud smile. He picked up his secure red phone, which connected directly to the senior trading floor below us. He barked a series of rapid-fire instructions to his elite acquisition team. His orders were absolute and unforgiving. He authorized the immediate purchase of the entire $300 million debt package, demanding a swift and silent execution from his top brokers. Within exactly 45 minutes, the massive financial transaction was completely finalized. The nervous banking executives enthusiastically sold off the toxic debt to our private equity firm, signing away their administrative rights with tremendous relief. The digital ink dried on the acquisition contracts, locking the trap firmly shut. I stood looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. The legal transfer was officially complete. The banks no longer held the keys to Winston's kingdom. From this exact moment forward, the largest creditor holding the absolute power of life and death over their entire arrogant family was me. Across town, the atmosphere inside Winston's sprawling Upper East Side mansion was toxic and suffocating. Winston sat behind his massive mahogany desk, gripping a crystal glass of bourbon so hard his knuckles ached. He had just slammed the receiver onto the base of his antique telephone. The final shred of hope had evaporated into thin air. The primary lender had officially rejected his desperate plea for a 90-day extension on the $300 million balloon payment. The bank executive had been entirely unsympathetic, citing severe irregularities in the recent financial disclosures. The walls of their fraudulent real estate empire were buckling under the immense pressure. Harrison paced frantically across the imported Persian rug, running his trembling hands through his perfectly styled hair. He was sweating through his expensive designer shirt, terrified of losing his luxury cars, his status, and his mistresses. The heavy oak doors of the study flew open violently. Caroline stormed into the room, vibrating with absolute outrage. Her face was flushed with anger, and she clutched a useless piece of plastic in her manicured hand. She had just suffered the ultimate humiliation for a woman whose entire identity revolved around manufactured wealth. She had been standing inside the exclusive VIP room of a luxury boutique, attempting to purchase a rare $30,000 Hermes bag to soothe her nerves after the disastrous anniversary gala. The sales associate had swiped her titanium corporate credit card only to return with a polite but devastating smile, informing her the transaction was completely declined. The card was frozen. The bank had locked the account. Caroline was forced to walk out of the boutique empty-handed, while other wealthy socialites whispered behind her back. Caroline directed her blind fury not at her father or her brother who had bankrupted the family, but squarely at her husband. Donovan stood quietly near the towering bookshelves, observing the chaotic breakdown of the family he had married into. Caroline marched directly up to him, shoving the declined credit card into his chest. She demanded that he immediately hand over his personal banking cards. She screamed that she needed to go back and purchase the handbag to prove to the boutique staff that she was not destitute. Donovan looked down at her with cold, clinical precision. He was a highly respected cardiothoracic surgeon who spent his days holding human hearts in his hands, saving lives through sheer skill and dedication. He had spent years enduring the subtle racist microaggressions from this family, brushing off their snide remarks about his Detroit upbringing and his skin color, because he wanted to keep his family together for the sake of their young son. But the illusion was entirely shattered now. Donovan flatly refused to give her his card. He calmly stated that his hard-earned surgical salary was no longer going to fund her ridiculous vanity purchases while her family committed massive financial fraud. Caroline lost her mind completely. She unleashed a vicious barrage of insults showing the ugly, bigoted core of her personality. She yelled that Donovan owed her family everything. She claimed that marrying into their prestigious bloodline was the only reason a black man from a working-class neighborhood had ever gained access to elite society circles. She demanded he empty his savings account to bail out her father's company, calling him a useless freeloader for refusing to surrender his money. Harrison chimed in from across the room, aggressively ordering his brother-in-law to obey Caroline and show some respect to his betters. Donovan did not raise his voice. He did not engage in a screaming match with a room full of delusional narcissists. He looked at Caroline and saw a complete stranger. He saw the exact same toxic cruelty they had relentlessly inflicted upon Stella for 5 years. He realized that this family viewed anyone outside their bloodline as nothing more than a financial asset to be drained and discarded. If he stayed, they would eventually drag him down with them, ruining his impeccable medical career and corrupting his young son. Donovan turned his back on his screaming wife without uttering another word. He walked out of the stifling study and pulled his phone from his pocket. He immediately drafted a highly secure message to one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys in the city. He instructed the lawyer to initiate emergency divorce proceedings, file for full and sole physical custody of his child, and secure a financial restraining order to protect his personal assets from his wife's impending bankruptcy. Donovan was completely done playing their twisted game. Back inside the study, the panic was reaching a fever pitch. Winston poured himself another massive glass of bourbon, preparing to call his bankruptcy lawyers. Suddenly, the heavy antique telephone on his desk began to ring. The shrill sound cut through Caroline's ongoing tantrum. Winston stared at the phone for a long second before snatching the receiver. He barked his name into the mouthpiece, expecting another banking executive calling to demand immediate payment. Instead, the voice on the other end belonged to a senior managing director from the most powerful private equity titan in the financial district. Winston listened intently, his posture rigid. As the seconds ticked by, the deep wrinkles of stress on his forehead began to smooth out. The color rushed back into his pale face. A look of sheer euphoric triumph replaced his absolute despair. The managing director officially informed Winston that their private equity fund had just purchased the entirety of his $300 million debt portfolio from the banks. Furthermore, the fund was highly interested in restructuring the debt and providing a massive cash injection to stabilize the failing real estate company. They wanted to schedule an immediate in-person meeting at Winston's corporate headquarters to sign the exclusive rescue contracts. Winston slammed the phone down and let out a victorious roar that shook the walls of the study. He slammed his hands on the desk and announced that they were saved. A billionaire savior had swooped in at the 11th hour to buy their debt and inject fresh capital into their empire. Harrison threw his arms in the air, shouting in pure triumph, entirely forgetting the fact that he was about to be a homeless divorcee just 10 minutes prior. Caroline shrieked with joy, immediately pulling out her phone to call the boutique and reserve the bag she had been denied. Winston ordered Harrison to contact the board of directors and arrange a lavish red carpet reception at the corporate headquarters for the next morning. They were going to roll out the finest champagne and grovel at the feet of the private equity king who had just rescued their legacy. The entire family celebrated their miraculous survival completely and utterly unaware that the billionaire savior they were preparing to worship was actually the exact same mechanic they had relentlessly mocked and the furious daughter-in-law they had brutally discarded. The conference room on the top floor of my father's private equity firm was transformed into an execution chamber. There were no weapons or physical violence here, only mountains of legal paperwork that held the power to completely eradicate an entire family dynasty. I sat at the head of the massive obsidian glass table, flanked by a dozen of the most ruthless corporate litigators and financial forensic experts in Manhattan. The air conditioning hummed quietly, providing a stark contrast to the boiling tension of the impending slaughter. Spread out before me were the foreclosure documents. The papers were thick and heavy with the weight of absolute ruin. My legal team had spent the last several hours cross-referencing every single line of the $300 million debt portfolio my father had just purchased from the panicked banks. We were not simply acquiring their debt. We were meticulously building an inescapable financial cage. I dragged my expensive fountain pen across the signature line of the final authorization, legally sealing the fate of my father-in-law's commercial real estate empire. I gave a sharp nod to the lead attorney, a fierce woman who specialized in hostile corporate takeovers. "I want every single exit route completely barricaded," I instructed, my voice echoing cleanly off the glass walls. "The moment Winston signs the restructuring agreement tomorrow morning, our acceleration clauses must automatically trigger the absolute second he defaults on the new impossible terms we are setting. I want liens placed on every commercial property that carries his family name. I want injunctions filed against Harrison's personal assets. They have relied on sleazy corporate loopholes to survive for the past 5 years. Tonight, we permanently close every single one of those doors." The legal team nodded in perfect unison, their fingers flying rapidly across encrypted laptops. They were locking down the secondary holding companies Harrison had secretly established to hide his stolen funds. They were drafting the immediate seizure notices for the luxury vehicles the country club shares and the fraudulent offshore accounts. We were methodically stripping them of their financial oxygen. There would be absolutely no bridge loans, no silent partners, and no desperate bailouts available to them by tomorrow afternoon. Winston and Harrison were currently popping champagne and celebrating their salvation, utterly blind to the fact that they were dancing happily on a trapdoor I had personally wired with explosives. As the attorneys gathered the finalized foreclosure packets, my secure smartphone vibrated aggressively against the polished glass table. The screen lit up, cutting sharply through the dim, serious atmosphere of the war room. I glanced down and saw Harrison's name flash across the display. The sheer predictability of his arrogance was almost poetic. Even when he thought he had achieved ultimate victory, his fragile ego absolutely demanded that he kick the person he believed was already bleeding in the dirt. I swiped the screen open and read the message. The text was a chaotic, gloating mess of grammatical errors and unearned superiority. I am about to sign a $300 million bailout contract tomorrow morning, the message read. We found a billionaire private equity titan who actually recognizes true potential. Tomorrow I am going to be richer and more powerful than I have ever been. Meanwhile, you are probably wondering how you are going to afford your next hot meal. Get ready to receive your utility shutoff notices, you pathetic loser. You threw away a golden ticket and now you are going to rot in the gutter exactly where you belong. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen. A cold, genuine smile spread slowly across my face. Harrison was so profoundly delusional that he was actively bragging to his executioner about the very guillotine she had built for his neck. He honestly believed he had outsmarted the entire financial universe. He thought a mysterious billionaire was swooping in out of the goodness of his heart to reward his fraudulent business practices. He had no idea that the titan he was preparing to grovel before was the man he repeatedly called a grease monkey. And he certainly had no idea that the ultimate decision-maker, the person holding the pen that would sign his absolute death warrant, was the woman he had slapped across the face just 24 hours ago. My fingers hovered over the digital keyboard. A lesser person might have hurled a vicious insult back. A weaker woman might have ruined the surprise just to feel a fleeting moment of immediate vindication. But I knew the supreme devastating power of total silence. I did not type a single letter. I did not send a mocking emoji or a sarcastic remark. I simply locked the screen and let the dark void swallow his desperate need for attention. The deafening silence would eat away at his anxiety, leaving him to scream his arrogant nonsense into an empty abyss. I stood up from the conference table, dismissing the elite legal team with a final nod of approval. The trap was flawlessly set, the documents were weaponized, and the stage was perfectly arranged for the grand finale. I walked out of the corporate war room and took the private elevator up to my personal residential suite in the penthouse. It was time to prepare for the final act of this theatrical tragedy. I stepped into my expansive walk-in closet. The recessed lighting automatically illuminated rows of immaculate high-end designer clothing. For 5 agonizing years, I had dressed to blend in and disappear. I had worn muted colors, generic pencil skirts, and sensible shoes to play the part of the modest middle-class daughter-in-law who knew her inferior place. I had actively suppressed my own powerful presence to avoid bruising Harrison's incredibly fragile masculinity. That era was permanently over. Tomorrow I was not walking into their headquarters as a submissive wife or an anonymous risk analyst. I was walking in as the apex predator of Wall Street. I bypassed the conservative businesswear and walked directly toward a garment bag hanging at the very end of the rack. I unzipped the dark canvas, revealing a masterpiece of modern power tailoring. It was a custom-made Tom Ford suit in a striking deep midnight blue. The expensive fabric was sharp, unforgiving, and cut with absolute lethal precision. The shoulders were structured to project undeniable authority, and the trousers fell in a perfect razor-sharp line. I ran my hand along the lapel, feeling the heavy, luxurious weight of the material. This was not just clothing. This was armor. It was the physical manifestation of the $2 billion empire I had kept hidden in the shadows. I paired the suit with a crisp, stark white silk blouse and a pair of black Christian Louboutin stiletto heels featuring their signature blood-red soles. That striking flash of red would be the last thing Harrison saw as I walked out of his ruined company. I stood before the full-length mirror, holding the tailored jacket against my body. The dark bruise on my cheek was still highly visible, a lingering, violent reminder of the disrespect I had endured. I could have easily covered it with heavy foundation, but I decided firmly against it. I wanted them to look directly at that bruise tomorrow. I wanted Winston and Harrison to stare at the physical proof of their horrific arrogance while I systematically stripped them of everything they held dear. I hung the suit meticulously on the wooden valet stand. The game of hiding was over. Tomorrow morning the hunt officially begins. The morning sun glared off the polished glass facade of Winston's corporate headquarters. Inside the sprawling lobby, the atmosphere was electric, with an unearned sense of absolute victory. A literal red velvet carpet had been rolled out across the imported Italian marble floors, stretching from the heavy revolving doors all the way to the private executive elevators. The entire board of directors had been summoned for an emergency morning reception. These elderly, wealthy men and women stood in nervous clusters, holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne at 10 o'clock in the morning. They were utterly exhausted from weeks of dodging bankruptcy rumors, but today they were commanded to celebrate. Harrison stood at the absolute center of the room, basking in the desperate attention of the board members. He was dressed in a pristine charcoal gray bespoke suit, with a silk tie that screamed of new money arrogance. He held a glass of champagne in one hand, while using the other to gesture grandly as he spun his web of total delusion. He boldly claimed full responsibility for the miraculous financial rescue. He looked the anxious investors dead in the eye and confidently lied about his masterful negotiation skills. "I knew exactly how to play this market," Harrison bragged, his voice echoing loudly across the lobby. "While everyone else was panicking about market fluctuations, I was working back channels. I reached out to a highly exclusive private equity fund. These billionaires do not just hand out $300 million to anyone. They look for visionary leadership. They recognize that my recent commercial developments were actually ahead of their time. The managing director practically begged me to let them buy our debt and inject fresh capital into my projects. We are not just surviving today, gentlemen. We are expanding." The board members nodded eagerly, swallowing his ridiculous lies because they were too terrified to question their sudden salvation. They clapped him on the back and praised his supposed financial genius. Harrison soaked up the fraudulent admiration like a sponge, completely blind to the fact that his visionary projects were the exact reason they were staring down the barrel of total corporate annihilation just a few hours ago. Standing perfectly positioned beside her brother was Caroline. She was wearing a vibrant designer dress and a smile so painfully fake it looked like it might crack her face. She was practically vibrating with toxic excitement, completely ignoring the sheer embarrassment she had suffered at the boutique the day before. Her only goal this morning was to flatter her father and brother enough to get her frozen bank accounts immediately reinstated so she could run straight back to the luxury shopping district. "You are an absolute genius, Harrison," Caroline cooed loudly, making sure Winston could hear her excessive praise. "I told Donovan this morning that my brother was going to save the entire family legacy single-handedly. It takes a real man to pull off a deal like this." She mentioned her husband with a casual dismissive wave of her manicured hand. When a board member politely asked where the esteemed surgeon was this morning, Caroline let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Oh, you know, Donovan," Caroline complained, rolling her eyes dramatically. "He claimed he was suddenly called into a marathon emergency surgery. He is always choosing the hospital over supporting his own family. But honestly, it is probably for the best. He never truly understood the complexities of high-level corporate finance anyway. He would just stand around looking completely out of place among us." Caroline was entirely wrong. Donovan was not standing in an operating room holding a scalpel. At this exact moment, Donovan was sitting comfortably in a plush leather chair inside a high-rise legal office downtown. He was wearing a sharp, tailored suit and holding a very different kind of instrument. He was gripping a heavy titanium pen and signing his name on a stack of expedited divorce papers. His legal team had already secured an emergency freezing order on his personal medical accounts, ensuring Caroline could not touch a single cent of his hard-earned surgeon salary. He was also signing the final affidavits for full and sole physical custody of their young son, citing her extreme financial negligence and emotionally unstable behavior. Donovan was surgically excising the rotting tumor of this toxic family from his life forever. Winston paced near the front glass doors, constantly checking his solid gold wristwatch. He was practically salivating at the thought of greeting the private equity titan who had purchased their massive debt portfolio. He had ordered his public relations team to have photographers discreetly positioned behind the velvet ropes to capture the historic handshake. Winston needed the financial press to document his glorious comeback. He wanted the front page of every business journal to feature his smiling face standing next to the billionaire savior who had validated his entire crooked empire. "Look sharp, everyone," Winston barked, clapping his hands together to command the attention of the lobby. "The motorcade is exactly 2 minutes away. When the chairman walks through those doors, I want absolute perfection. We must show them why our brand is the undisputed king of commercial real estate. Harrison, button your jacket. Caroline, stop checking your phone and stand up straight. This is the moment we cement our legacy for the next 100 years." The low, heavy rumble of high-performance engines suddenly vibrated through the thick glass walls of the corporate lobby. A collective gasp of anticipation rippled through the gathered board members. Outside on the bustling Manhattan street, traffic practically stopped as a convoy of 3 imposing vehicles pulled smoothly up to the curb. It was a fleet of immaculate midnight black Maybach sedans, perfectly synchronized and gleaming aggressively under the morning sun. The lead vehicle stopped exactly at the base of the red carpet. The imposing presence of the armored cars radiated an aura of terrifying, limitless wealth. Winston and Harrison practically shoved each other out of the way as they bolted through the revolving doors. They rushed down the steps and stopped right at the edge of the curb, gasping slightly from their eager sprint. They stood side by side, straightening their silk ties and pasting on the most sickeningly sweet, sycophantic smiles humanly possible. They were practically vibrating with desperate submission, entirely prepared to bow down and kiss the shoes of the billionaire who held their financial lives in his hands. The heavy reinforced door of the lead Maybach swung open with a quiet, mechanical hiss. 2 massive private security contractors stepped out first, scanning the perimeter with cold efficiency before taking their positions on either side of the vehicle. Winston and Harrison practically vibrated with anticipation on the curb, their faces stretched into painful, desperate smiles. They were ready to worship whoever stepped out of that car. A polished leather shoe touched the pavement, followed by the imposing figure of the billionaire savior himself. Alexander stepped into the morning sunlight, and the sheer gravitational pull of his presence commanded absolute silence from the bustling Manhattan street. He was a terrifying vision of apex corporate power. The grease-stained flannel and scuffed work boots from 5 years ago were completely gone. In their place, he wore a custom-tailored charcoal gray Armani suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders. A crisp, brilliant white dress shirt contrasted sharply against a midnight blue silk tie. A platinum Patek Philippe watch gleamed subtly at his wrist, serving as a quiet indicator of wealth that surpassed their wildest imaginations. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and his posture radiated the kind of terrifying authority that could only be forged in the ruthless fires of Wall Street. Winston literally shoved his own son out of the way to be the first to greet the Titan. He extended both of his hands, bowing his head in a pathetic display of absolute submission. "Welcome to our headquarters!" Chairman Winston gushed, his voice trembling with eager sycophancy. "I am Winston, the founder of this enterprise, and this is my son Harrison. We are profoundly honored to have you here today. Words cannot express our gratitude for your visionary investment in our family legacy." Alexander did not smile. He looked down at Winston's outstretched hands for a long, agonizing moment before finally offering a brief, bone-crushing handshake. He locked eyes with Winston and then turned his piercing gaze to Harrison. The absolute irony of the situation was almost suffocating. These 2 arrogant men were furiously groveling at the feet of the exact same man they had relentlessly mocked and degraded for the past 5 years. But because of their blinding classism and their fundamental inability to view working-class people as actual human beings, they had completely failed to recognize him. They only saw the expensive Armani suit, the fleet of Maybach sedans, and the $300 million lifeline he represented. The lowly mechanic they despised had been entirely erased by their blinding greed. "Lead the way," Alexander commanded, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that left absolutely no room for debate. Winston and Harrison scrambled over each other to guide him up the red carpet. As they entered the grand lobby, the gathered board of directors broke into enthusiastic applause. Caroline clapped the loudest, flashing a dazzling fake smile, hoping the billionaire would notice her. Alexander ignored every single one of them. He did not wave, he did not nod, and he did not break his stride. He walked through the cheering crowd with the cold, detached efficiency of an executioner marching to the gallows. They rushed him into the private executive elevator, pressing the button for the 50th floor. The ride up to the glass penthouse was agonizingly tense. Winston and Harrison filled the enclosed space with desperate, nervous chatter. They bragged about their commercial properties, their future expansion plans, and their supposed genius market strategies. Alexander remained utterly silent. He stared straight ahead, watching the floor numbers tick upward, letting the suffocating weight of his silence slowly crush their artificial confidence. The more he said nothing, the more desperately they babbled, proving exactly how weak and vulnerable they truly were. The silver doors slid open, revealing the crown jewel of their fraudulent empire. The 50th floor conference room was a stunning glass-enclosed sanctuary, offering a panoramic 360-degree view of the Manhattan skyline. A massive, polished obsidian table dominated the center of the room. Alexander did not wait for an invitation. He walked straight past the designated guest chairs and moved directly to the head of the table. This was Winston's traditional seat of power, the throne from which he ruled his company. Alexander pulled the heavy leather chair back and sat down, claiming absolute dominance over the room. Winston did not dare to protest. Instead, he eagerly took a subordinate seat to the right while Harrison quickly sat to the left. They were perfectly happy to surrender their dignity if it meant saving their bank accounts. Winston reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, luxurious, leather-bound folder. His hands shook slightly, with a mixture of adrenaline and sheer desperation as he opened it. Inside rested the master restructuring contracts, the legal documents that would finalize the $300 million debt buyout and inject fresh survival capital into their dying veins. He practically slid the heavy folder across the smooth glass surface, pushing it directly in front of Alexander. Winston then removed a solid gold Mont Blanc fountain pen from his breast pocket and laid it carefully next to the signature line. "Everything is perfectly prepared," Chairman Winston said, his voice dripping with honeyed desperation. "The board has already pre-approved all of your stipulations. Once you sign these papers, our partnership will be officially cemented. We are ready to make you billions. We just need your authorization to begin this glorious new chapter." The room fell dead silent. Harrison leaned forward in his chair, holding his breath, his eyes fixed hungrily on the golden pen. This was the moment. The salvation they had prayed for was mere inches away. Alexander looked down at the crisp white pages of the contract. He looked at the golden pen. Then he slowly raised his head and locked his cold, predatory eyes directly onto Winston's sweating face. He did not reach for the pen. Instead, he placed his large hands flat on the glass table and pushed the leather-bound folder away, sliding it right back across the table toward a horrified Winston. "I am not the chief executive officer of the fund," Alexander stated, his voice dropping the temperature in the room to absolute zero. "I am only the chairman of the board. I do not handle the day-to-day operational acquisitions. The person who holds the ultimate executive authority, the only person with the power to sign the funds that will save your miserable lives, is walking into this room right now." The heavy double oak doors of the 50th floor conference room swung open with a violent, echoing thud that made every single board member jump in their expensive leather seats. The sound of confident, measured footsteps pierced the suffocating silence of the room. It was the sharp, unmistakable click of Christian Louboutin stiletto heels striking the polished marble floor. I walked into the executive sanctuary not as a submissive wife, but as the absolute apex predator of the financial food chain. The custom midnight blue Tom Ford suit wrapped around my frame like a suit of modern armor, projecting an aura of lethal authority. The stark white silk blouse contrasted sharply against the dark fabric, making the blood-red soles of my shoes pop with every deliberate step I took. My head was held high. The ugly purple bruise on my left cheekbone was completely exposed for every single person in that room to witness. I did not try to hide the violence my husband had inflicted upon me the previous night. I wore it proudly like a battle scar, demonstrating that his pathetic attempt to break me had only forged a monster that was about to swallow his entire legacy whole. I bypassed the long row of stunned corporate executives and walked directly to the head of the obsidian glass table. I came to a stop standing perfectly straight right beside Alexander. I placed my hand casually on the back of his heavy leather chair, asserting my absolute dominance over the space. Winston stared at me as if a ghost had just walked through the solid glass walls. His mouth hung open in a grotesque display of sheer cognitive dissonance. His brain was violently rejecting the reality standing right in front of his eyes. A thick bead of nervous sweat rolled slowly down his wrinkled temple. He looked at my expensive tailored suit. He looked at my confident, unwavering posture. He looked at the way Alexander, the terrifying Wall Street titan he was currently groveling before, did not even flinch at my sudden intrusion. The mathematical impossibility of his despised daughter-in-law standing shoulder to shoulder with his billionaire savior was causing a massive short circuit in his arrogant mind. Winston could not process how the charity case he loved to torture was sharing the exact same commanding air as the man holding his $300 million lifeline. Harrison was the first to break the heavy, paralyzed silence. His face turned a violent shade of crimson. The fragile illusion of his corporate superiority shattered the second he saw me breathing the same rarefied air as his precious investors. He could not comprehend that I was anything other than a desperate homeless woman coming to beg for her life back. He forcefully shoved his chair back, making it screech loudly and obnoxiously against the pristine floor. He slammed both of his fists onto the glass table, sending a violent tremor through the crystal water glasses lined up across the center. The veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his tight silk collar. "What the hell are you doing here?" Harrison roared, his voice cracking with pure, unhinged fury. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my bruised face, entirely ignoring the professional setting. "How did you even get past the lobby security? I told them to throw you out on the street where you belong. You have absolutely no right to step foot in this building ever again." Harrison frantically turned his head toward the heavy oak doors, desperately searching for the company guards. "Security," he bellowed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing frantically off the panoramic windows. "Get in here right now. Drag this crazy woman out of my building immediately. She is completely out of her mind. She is having a massive psychotic breakdown because I finally kicked her out. Do not let her bother our investor for another second. Grab her and throw her in the service elevator before she ruins this entire deal." The entire board of directors erupted into a chaotic symphony of panicked whispers and outraged gasps. Elderly shareholders clutched their briefcases, looking frantically between Harrison and Alexander, entirely unsure of how this domestic drama was going to impact their desperate financial rescue. They murmured loudly about my audacity, openly judging my bruised face and my commanding presence. They were horrified that a messy divorce dispute was spilling into their sacred corporate sanctuary. The board members completely believed Harrison's false narrative. They genuinely thought I was an unstable, hysterical ex-wife trying to sabotage a billionaire buyout. They were completely unaware that the woman they were judging was actually the Grim Reaper holding the scythe directly over their collective heads. Two burly corporate security guards wearing standard gray uniforms rushed into the conference room, responding to Harrison's frantic screaming. They moved aggressively toward the head of the table, reaching their thick hands out with the clear intention to grab my arms and forcefully remove me from the premises. Harrison smiled a cruel, victorious smile, expecting to see me physically humiliated and dragged away like common garbage in front of the most powerful people in the city. But those company guards never even made it within 5 feet of my tailored suit. The four massive private security contractors who had accompanied Alexander moved with terrifying lethal speed. They stepped smoothly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall of tailored black fabric and tactical precision. In absolute perfect unison, the elite bodyguards reached under their suit jackets. The sharp mechanical click of heavy-duty stun guns being drawn and activated echoed loudly over the chaotic noise of the boardroom. The bright blue electrical arcs crackled fiercely at the tips of the weapons, sending a harsh, intimidating buzzing sound ripping through the air. The two corporate guards instantly froze in their tracks, raising their hands in immediate surrender. They were utterly terrified by the highly trained armed men actively protecting me. The entire room fell into a stunned, paralyzed silence once again. The board members stopped whispering. Winston stopped breathing. And Harrison was left standing at the table with his mouth hanging wide open, watching in absolute horror as the billionaire investor's personal security team threatened to electrocute anyone who dared to touch me. The crackling blue electricity of the stun guns faded into a terrifying silence, but the lethal threat hanging in the air remained absolute. The two corporate security guards slowly backed away with their hands raised in total surrender, retreating into the shadows of the doorway. Harrison stood frozen at the table, his outstretched arms slowly falling to his side. His brain was desperately trying to rationalize the impossible scene unfolding before him. He looked wildly at Alexander, expecting the billionaire titan to be deeply offended by my sudden intrusion. He expected the powerful man to demand my immediate removal. "Chairman, I am so incredibly sorry for this massive disruption," Harrison stammered, his voice trembling as he tried to salvage the ruined atmosphere. "This woman is completely delusional. She is my estranged wife, and she is having a severe mental breakdown. Please let my security handle this so we can return to our critical business discussion. I promise you she has absolutely nothing to do with this company or this investment." Alexander did not even blink at Harrison's pathetic scrambling. He slowly unbuttoned his custom Armani suit jacket with chilling, deliberate calmness. He reached a large, powerful hand toward the center of the table where his security chief had just placed a thick, heavy stack of legal files. These were not the bailout contracts Winston had so eagerly prepared. These were the finalized foreclosure documents my legal team had ruthlessly drafted the night before. Alexander picked up the massive stack of papers. He lifted it high into the air and brought it down violently against the obsidian glass table. The impact sounded like a literal gunshot echoing off the panoramic windows and making every single board member physically jump out of their expensive leather chairs. "You pathetic, arrogant little boy," Alexander roared, his deep baritone voice vibrating the very floorboards beneath our feet. "You dare call your cheap mall cops to throw my biological daughter out of this room. You dare threaten the sole chief executive officer of my entire private equity firm." The collective gasp from the board of directors sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the massive room. Elderly shareholders clutched their chests, staring at me with eyes wide with absolute shock and horror. Alexander turned his lethal, predatory gaze away from Harrison and locked it entirely onto Winston. The older man was already trembling violently in his seat, gripping the armrest so hard his fingernails were turning blue. "Tell me, Winston," Alexander demanded, his voice dropping into a cold, deadly register that promised total annihilation. "Do you still think my money is too filthy for your pristine bank accounts? 5 years ago, you looked me dead in the eye and treated me like absolute garbage in your own home. You called me a lowly grease monkey. You confidently told your country club friends that I was a pathetic, uneducated mechanic who did not belong in your presence. Are my hands still too dirty to sign your salvation checks today?" The blood drained completely from Winston's face, leaving him a sickly, chalky white. The deep wrinkles on his forehead seemed to age him 20 years in a matter of seconds. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish suffocating on dry land. The terrifying puzzle pieces were violently snapping together in his arrogant mind. The words daughter and mechanic collided with the reality of the billionaire standing before him. Winston remembered the man in the faded flannel shirt and scuffed work boots from 5 years ago. He superimposed that memory over the terrifying financial titan currently wearing a tailored Armani suit and a platinum watch. The horrific, catastrophic truth finally broke through his impenetrable wall of classism. The mechanic he had relentlessly mocked was the most ruthless private equity kingmaker on Wall Street, and the destitute daughter-in-law he had actively encouraged his son to abuse was the sole heir to an unimaginable $2 billion empire. Harrison collapsed backward into his chair, as if his knees had been physically shattered. His perfectly styled hair fell into his eyes, but he did not even try to brush it away. He stared at the dark purple bruise on my left cheekbone, the exact bruise he had violently put there just 12 hours ago. He realized with crushing, nauseating clarity that he had not just assaulted a submissive, dependent wife. He had publicly struck the most powerful corporate predator in the city. The staggering magnitude of his colossal mistake paralyzed his vocal cords. He had spent years bragging about his visionary business acumen, while actively torturing the one woman who held the absolute power of life and death over his entire existence. The fragile, obedient facade I had maintained for 5 agonizing years shattered completely, leaving absolutely nothing but cold, calculating reality in its wake. The quiet risk analyst who wore cheap clothes and kept her head down was dead and buried. I stood tall in my midnight blue Tom Ford suit, radiating a dark magnetic power that commanded the entire room. The board members shrank back in their seats, utterly terrified of the financial monster I had just revealed myself to be. They looked at my red-soled stiletto heels and my icy, unbothered stare, and they knew instantly that their company was already a corpse. I was not a victim seeking a meager divorce settlement. I was the executioner arriving to collect their heads. I stepped away from my father's side, moving with elegant, terrifying grace. The rhythmic click of my heels against the marble floor was the only sound in the dead silent room. I walked slowly around the massive obsidian table, savoring the absolute terror radiating from the men who had made my life a living hell. I stopped directly across from Harrison. I reached out and pulled back a heavy leather executive chair. I sat down, smoothing my tailored trousers and crossing my legs with total supreme confidence. I leaned forward, resting my forearms gracefully on the cool glass surface of the table. I lifted my right hand and began tapping my manicured fingernails against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was like a ticking clock counting down the final seconds of their miserable, wealthy lives. I looked directly into Harrison's horrified, bloodshot eyes. A slow, beautiful smile spread across my face, completely devoid of any human warmth. "Hello, ex-husband," I said, my voice carrying a cheerful, deadly clarity. "Shall we begin the meeting?" I did not wait for my ex-husband to find his voice. I did not give him a single second to recover his shattered ego. I raised my hand slightly and snapped my fingers. The lead forensic accountant from my father's team stepped forward immediately. She placed 3 massive black binders directly onto the center of the obsidian glass table. I pushed the thickest binder straight toward the oldest and most influential shareholder on the board. The heavy thud of the binder echoed like a judge striking a wooden gavel. "I suggest you open that to page 1. I said, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a commanding officer. "What you are looking at is the actual unredacted financial autopsy of this dying company. It is not the fabricated fairy tale of visionary expansion that Harrison just spent the last hour feeding you. It is the cold, hard, mathematical truth." The elderly board member hesitantly opened the binder. His eyes darted across the highlighted spreadsheets. Within 10 seconds, the color completely drained from his face. He gasped, pulling his reading glasses down from his forehead to stare closer at the catastrophic numbers. "Let us start with the $12 million tax discrepancy," I announced, pacing slowly behind the row of seated executives. For the past 2 years, Winston and Harrison have been deliberately cooking the books to hide their massive operating losses from the federal government. they used a complex network of offshore shell companies to funnel commercial rent revenue out of the country. I know this because I am the anonymous risk analyst who had to constantly untangle their illegal accounting webs just to keep the federal authorities from raiding this building. Harrison jumped up from his chair, his face a mask of panicked desperation. "That is a complete lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You do not understand high-level commercial development. You are taking aggressive tax strategies entirely out of context. Board members, please do not listen to this hysterical woman. She is just an angry, bitter ex-wife trying to ruin my reputation with fake documents." I did not even raise my voice. I simply tapped the second black binder on the table. "Turn to page 47. I instructed the room, ignoring Harrison's pathetic outburst entirely. "There you will find the complete bank routing logs for what Harrison likes to call his visionary commercial projects." The board members frantically flipped through the pages. Horrified whispers began to ripple through the room as they saw their own investment capital listed next to fraudulent vendors. "Those projects do not actually exist," I stated, watching the devastating realization dawn on the investors' faces. "They are ghost properties. Harrison poured $90 million of your capital into empty dirt lots in prime locations. He paid premium prices for building permits that expired over 3 years ago. He wired millions to fraudulent contractors who miraculously vanished into thin air the very next day. But the money did not actually vanish. It was simply rerouted back into his personal hidden accounts." The room grew incredibly tense. The shareholders were reading the exact transaction dates and amounts mapping the theft of their own wealth. "He did not use your investment capital to build skyscrapers." I continued, my voice sharp as a razor blade. "He used your money to fund his extravagant lifestyle. He used it to buy $40,000 Cartier watches for his mistresses. He used your hard-earned equity to lease luxury sports cars and pay for private jets while the foundation of this real estate empire rotted from the inside out. He built a towering skyscraper of toxic debt on a swamp of his own absolute incompetence." The board of directors completely erupted. These were ruthless, wealthy men and women who protected their fortunes with vicious intensity. They did not tolerate being stolen from. The entire room turned their unbridled fury directly onto Winston and Harrison. An older investor slammed his fists on the table, screaming that he would call the Federal Bureau of Investigation right this second. Another shareholder threw his crystal champagne flute against the wall, shattering it into 100 pieces, as he demanded his money back. The polished, sophisticated executives morphed into a terrifying, angry mob, demanding immediate retribution. Harrison tried desperately to speak over the deafening outrage. He held his hands up, sweating profusely, begging them to listen. He claimed it was just a temporary liquidity issue caused by unexpected market shifts. He promised that the new private equity buyout would cover the missing funds and make them all billionaires by tomorrow. But his words were completely useless. The ironclad proof was right there in black and white, featuring his own forged digital signatures and undeniable bank transfer receipts. The grand illusion of his financial genius was dead and buried forever. Winston sat utterly paralyzed in his chair. He looked at the angry mob of investors screaming for his arrest. He looked at the mountain of forensic evidence spread across his conference table. Then he looked at the $300 million debt maturity notice sitting at the very bottom of the pile. The catastrophic reality finally crushed the last remaining ounce of his arrogant pride. His legendary corporate legacy, the empire he had spent 4 decades building, was entirely destroyed. Winston realized with terrifying clarity that the only person on earth holding the leash to the guillotine was the woman standing in the midnight blue suit. He practically slid out of his expensive leather chair. His knees buckled slightly as he moved around the table toward me. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely keep them at his sides. The powerful, intimidating patriarch had completely vanished, leaving only a terrified, pathetic old man facing total financial ruin and federal prison. "Stella, please." Winston begged, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He reached his trembling hands out toward me, stopping just short of touching my tailored jacket. You cannot do this to us. You cannot let them destroy everything I have built. I stared at him with eyes as cold as glacial ice, allowing him to feel the full weight of his impending doom. We are your family, Stella. Winston pleaded, heavy tears actually forming in the corners of his wrinkled eyes, spilling over his pathetic pride. You have been married to my son for 5 years. You shared a home with us. We took you in when you had nothing. I know we have had our differences, but you cannot throw your own husband to the wolves. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Just sign the restructuring agreement. Authorize the loan from your father's fund. Save our company. Show some mercy for the sake of your marriage. I stared down at the broken old man weeping at my feet. Winston was shedding genuine tears of terror, but they did not move a single fiber of my being. I slowly stood up from the heavy leather executive chair, smoothing the crisp lines of my midnight blue suit. The entire boardroom held its collective breath, waiting for my final verdict. You ask for mercy in the name of a marriage, your son completely destroyed. I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air with absolute lethal precision. You plead for salvation in the name of a family that treated me like a disposable servant for 5 agonizing years. You think shedding a few pathetic tears today erases the fact that you spent half a decade deliberately trying to break my spirit. You do not know the true meaning of family, Winston. You only understand cruel transactional power. I did not reach for the golden fountain pen sitting on the glass table. I did not even glance at the desperate bailout restructuring agreement they had so eagerly prepared. Instead, I reached inside the tailored breast pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a single thick document bound in heavy red legal backing. It was not a financial lifeline, it was an absolute death warrant. I tossed the document directly onto the center of the obsidian table, right on top of their fraudulent financial ledgers. The heavy paper landed with a definitive smack. I want you to read the bold print at the top of that page, I commanded. Winston leaned forward with violently shaking hands, staring at the thick black ink. His breath hitched painfully in his throat as his eyes scanned the legal terminology. It was a notice of default and immediate foreclosure. My private equity fund did not come here today to sign a bailout contract, I announced, my words ringing out with brutal absolute finality. We did not come here to save your miserable, rotting empire. We came here because we have already purchased the entirety of your $300 million toxic debt from your panicked lenders. We own every single outstanding loan your company holds. We are your sole and absolute creditor. And because you are currently in massive unrecoverable breach of those loan covenants, I am officially accelerating the debt. I am foreclosing on this entire corporate building, I am seizing your commercial portfolios, and I am immediately confiscating the sprawling suburban mansion you and your arrogant family currently reside in. The sheer magnitude of my declaration hit Harrison like a physical freight train. The arrogant, entitled vice president who had spent his entire life bullying those beneath him completely shattered into a million pathetic pieces. The realization that he was suddenly absolutely penniless stripped away his fake bravado in an instant. He had no luxury cars left. He had no trust fund to fall back on. He did not even have a bed to sleep in tonight. The sudden, terrifying freefall into total crushing poverty broke his fragile, narcissistic mind. Harrison let out a pathetic, strangled sob. He literally dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor, abandoning every ounce of his remaining dignity. He crawled frantically around the edge of the massive glass table, dragging his expensive tailored trousers across the ground. He reached my side and desperately threw his arms around my legs, burying his tear-stained face against my knees. "Stella, please," he wept, his voice a high-pitched, pathetic whine that echoed shamefully across the silent boardroom. "Please do not do this to me. I am so incredibly sorry. I was wrong about everything. You have to understand the immense pressure I was under. The financial stress was completely destroying my mind. That is the only reason I hit you last night. I swear to God I never meant to hurt you. I was just so terrified of losing the company that I lost my temper. I love you, Stella. I have always loved you. Please just give me one more chance to be the husband you deserve. Do not throw me out on the street to die. I looked down at the sniveling, miserable creature clinging desperately to my legs. This was the exact same man who had publicly struck me across the face just 12 hours ago. This was the same man who stood in the lobby this morning with his mistress laughing maliciously about how I would freeze under a bridge. He was not apologizing because he felt genuine remorse for his horrific violence. He was only apologizing because the heavy steel door of the bank vault had just slammed violently shut on his greedy fingers. He was a coward attempting to weaponize fake love and manipulate my emotions to save his empty bank accounts. I felt a deep, overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered disgust rise in my chest. "Get your filthy hands off me!" I growled, my voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural tone. I took a forceful step backward, physically kicking his desperate arms away from my legs. Harrison stumbled and fell back onto the polished marble, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. He raised his shaking hands in a pathetic defensive gesture, hoping his loud sobbing would somehow change my mind. Alexander stood silently in the background, watching the entire scene unfold, with a cold, proud smile, recognizing the absolute strength of his daughter. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I planted my stiletto heels firmly on the ground, twisting my hips to generate maximum leverage. I pulled my right arm back and swung it forward with every ounce of furious, devastating strength I possessed. My open palm struck the side of Harrison's face with a thunderous, explosive crack that echoed violently throughout the entire boardroom. The sheer brutal force of the impact snapped his head hard to the side, sending a spray of his salty tears across the glass table. Harrison collapsed completely onto the floor, clutching his bright red, stinging cheek in absolute shock. A collective gasp ripped through the board of directors, but not a single person moved to help him. They simply watched in stunned silence as the arrogant heir received exactly what he had mercilessly dished out to others. I stood towering over him, my chest heaving slightly as the adrenaline surged hot and fast through my veins. My hand stung sharply from the forceful impact, but the immense, deeply satisfying relief washing over my soul was indescribable. I had just reclaimed every single ounce of my stolen dignity. That slap was payback for the anniversary night. I stated, my voice icy calm and ringing with supreme, undeniable authority. You do not ever get to touch me again. You do not ever get to speak to me again. I looked away from his pathetic, bleeding face and swept my cold gaze across Winston and the rest of his ruined family. From this exact moment forward, you have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap personal belongings you can carry and vacate my property. If you are still inside my buildings by tomorrow morning, I will have my security teams physically drag you out to the curb, like the trash you truly are. The private security contractors physically corralled Winston and Harrison out of the glass conference room and herded them toward the executive elevators. The ride down to the ground floor was entirely silent, suffocating under the heavy, crushing weight of their total defeat. When the silver doors finally parted, the chaotic reality of their destruction spilled out into the open lobby. The lavish red velvet carpet still stretched across the imported Italian marble floor, but it now looked like a bloody path leading straight to a corporate graveyard. Caroline was waiting frantically near the main reception desk. She saw her father stumbling out of the elevator like a hollow, soulless shell. She saw her brother nursing a violently bruised and swollen cheek, his designer suit wrinkled and disheveled. Instead of showing an ounce of genuine human concern for her family, her deeply ingrained entitlement flared into pure, unhinged rage. She locked her furious eyes on me, her face twisting into an ugly, distorted mask of absolute hatred. She stomped aggressively across the marble floor, her expensive designer heels clicking frantically, fully prepared to throw the mother of all tantrums. "What did you do to them?" Caroline shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a perfectly manicured finger inches from my face. "You malicious, psychotic gold digger. You think you can just walk into this building and ruin my family. I want my bank accounts turned back on this instant." You are going to pay for this, Stella. I will personally make sure my father's lawyers lock you in a psychiatric ward for the rest of your pathetic life. I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still in my midnight blue suit, watching her completely humiliate herself in front of the remaining board members and terrified lobby staff. Her utter detachment from reality was almost fascinating to witness. Before I could deliver the final crushing blow to her fragile suburban existence, the heavy revolving glass doors at the front of the corporate building spun rapidly. The bustling, chaotic noise of the Manhattan street spilled into the pristine lobby, followed immediately by the imposing, commanding figure of Donovan. He was no longer wearing his green surgical scrubs. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal suit that radiated absolute power and uncompromising respect. Flanking him was a stern, silver-haired man clutching a thick leather briefcase. Anyone with an ounce of legal knowledge would instantly recognize the man as the most ruthless predatory family law attorney in the entire state of New York. Caroline whipped around, her eyes widening with a sudden desperate flash of toxic hope. She ran toward her husband, completely misreading the cold, lethal determination radiating from his athletic frame. "Donovan, thank God you are finally here," Caroline cried out in a high-pitched, frantic voice, grabbing roughly at his tailored sleeve. "This crazy woman is trying to steal my father's company. You need to call your bank right now and wire the funds to save us. I need my credit cards unfrozen immediately so I can hire a real legal team. Do not just stand there looking stupid, do what I am telling you to do." Donovan did not reach out to comfort her. He did not pull out his phone to transfer his hard-earned surgical salary to bail out a family of entitled racist frauds. He looked down at the woman he had married with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon examining a rotting terminal disease. He simply nodded to the silver-haired attorney standing beside him. The lawyer unclasped his leather briefcase with a sharp mechanical click and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy blue folder. He stepped forward with aggressive efficiency and pressed the papers firmly against Caroline's chest, forcing her to grab them before they crashed to the marble floor. "You are officially served," Caroline Donovan stated. His voice was a deep, resonant boom that echoed cleanly across the silent, captivated lobby. "I am absolutely done acting as the personal automated teller machine for a family of arrogant parasites. For years, you and your brother mocked my Detroit upbringing. You smiled for the charity cameras to look progressive, but behind closed doors, you treated a board-certified cardiothoracic surgeon like a second-class citizen purely because of the color of my skin. You drained my bank accounts to buy your ridiculous luxury handbags because your own trust fund dried up 3 years ago." Caroline stared down at the heavy blue folder in her trembling hands, her mouth opening and closing in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Donovan, what is this?" she stammered, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathy whisper. "It is your permanent eviction notice from my life," Donovan replied, his tone dropping to a chilling absolute 0. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, my legal team secured an emergency financial restraining order from a federal judge. Every single joint account we share is entirely frozen. Your access to my primary medical income is permanently revoked. Those titanium credit cards you love to flash around to impress your fake friends are completely worthless pieces of plastic. You do not have access to a single cent of my money." Caroline began to hyperventilate. The horrific reality of becoming entirely destitute was causing a massive, very public panic attack. She looked wildly at Winston and Harrison, but they were already bankrupt corpses, unable to save themselves, let alone her. But Donovan was not finished. He was ready to deliver the fatal, devastating strike that would end her existence as a mother. Furthermore, Donovan continued, stepping 1 inch closer to force her to look directly into his unwavering eyes. "I have officially filed for full and sole physical and legal custody of our son. You have zero independent income. You are deeply implicated in a massive federal financial fraud investigation tied to your father's rotting company. You possess absolutely no financial capability and zero moral character to raise a child. You view everyone, including your own son, as an accessory to boost your fake social status. I will never let you poison his developing mind the way this toxic family poisoned yours. The crushing weight of Donovan's words hit Caroline like a physical wrecking ball. The arrogant, toxic princess of the real estate empire completely and utterly shattered into a million jagged pieces. She let out a horrific, blood-curdling shriek that pierced the lobby, sounding like a wounded animal caught in a brutal steel trap. Her legs buckled violently beneath her expensive designer dress. She collapsed onto the cold Italian marble floor, the thick divorce papers scattering wildly around her shaking, convulsing body. She sobbed hysterically, screaming her husband's name, begging him not to take her child and her money. She finally realized the terrifying truth. She was left with absolutely nothing. No wealth, no status, no husband, and no son. She was entirely bankrupt in every single aspect of human existence. Donovan did not look down at her thrashing on the floor. He buttoned his suit jacket with calm, deliberate efficiency, completely immune to her performative weeping. He turned his head and looked across the expansive lobby, locking his dark eyes firmly with mine. We were two battered survivors who had walked through the exact same fire, enduring the psychological abuse of a family that genuinely believed they were untouchable gods. Donovan gave me a slow, firm nod of profound, absolute respect. It was a silent acknowledgement between two people who had successfully orchestrated the perfect execution. I returned the gesture, acknowledging the brilliant, lethal precision of his exit. Without casting a single glance backward at the weeping mess on the floor, Donovan turned around and walked out the heavy glass doors into the bright, crisp Manhattan air, leaving the ruined, weeping remnants of that horrific family behind him forever. The weeks that followed the brutal confrontation in the corporate lobby moved with the terrifying, unstoppable velocity of a high-speed train derailing. I did not just cripple their real estate empire financially. I handed the federal authorities the exact roadmap required to bury them under the prison. Less than 48 hours after I seized their toxic debt portfolio, a fleet of dark sport utility vehicles swarmed the corporate headquarters. Dozens of federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers flooded the 50th floor conference room, seizing encrypted servers, filing cabinets, and personal computers. Winston was escorted out of his own building in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his face pale with absolute terror. The Grand Patriarch of the Manhattan real estate elite was formally indicted on 32 counts of severe financial fraud, wire fraud, and massive tax evasion. The prosecuting attorneys, armed with the meticulous risk analysis reports I had anonymously compiled over 5 years, offered no plea deals, no reduced sentences, and no preferential treatment. The sheer volume of forged documents, ghost properties, and illegal offshore routing numbers was so overwhelming that the federal judge denied him bail. Winston was staring down the barrel of a mandatory 15-year federal prison sentence, entirely stripped of his wealth, his dignity, and his carefully constructed social status. He would spend his final years wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, locked in a concrete cell miles away from the country clubs he once ruled with an iron fist. His legacy was officially reduced to a cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics classes. Harrison experienced an entirely different, uniquely humiliating flavor of absolute destruction. His downfall was not just legal, it was viscerally personal and remarkably swift. The very evening he was unceremoniously thrown out of my corporate building, he managed to secure a cheap hotel room using the last few crumpled bills in his wallet. He foolishly believed he could still rely on the loyalty of his new mistress. He expected Vanessa to stand by his side and comfort his bruised ego, assuming his charm could overcome his sudden lack of capital. But women who are attracted to stolen corporate credit cards and $40,000 Cartier watches do not stick around when the bank accounts hit zero. Vanessa took one look at his frozen assets, packed her designer bags, and walked out the door without shedding a single tear or offering a word of comfort. She did not even leave a goodbye note. She simply took the expensive jewelry he had illegally purchased for her, pawned it for cash, and vanished into the city, leaving Harrison completely isolated in a cheap, suffocating room. His entire identity had been tied to his immense wealth, his tailored suits, and his ability to buy affection from superficial people. Stripped of his bank accounts and his powerful last name, he was nothing more than an arrogant hollow shell of a man, with no marketable skills and a highly toxic reputation that preceded him in every social circle. The rapid descent from a luxury penthouse to absolute squalor broke whatever remained of his fragile narcissistic mind. Within a month, Harrison was forced to move into a filthy, rundown motel on the miserable outskirts of the city. He was forced to eat cheap canned food and sleep on a mattress that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and despair. He could not find work at any respectable financial firm or even a mid-level corporate office. The industry had blacklisted him entirely, treating his name like a contagious disease. The golden boy of commercial real estate was reduced to sitting in a crowded, depressing call center for 10 hours a day. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting polyester shirt, wearing a plastic headset, and reading a generic robotic script off a glowing computer monitor. He spent his days cold, calling exhausted working-class families, desperately trying to sell low-tier life insurance policies for starvation wages. Every time a customer angrily hung up on him, he was brutally reminded of the incredible limitless power he once held and foolishly threw away. His manager, a man 10 years younger than him, constantly berated him for failing to meet his miserable daily quotas. He was trapped in a cycle of poverty, entirely invisible to the elite society that had once kissed his feet. The ultimate crushing blow to his shattered ego came on a crisp, bright Tuesday morning. Harrison used his meager lunch break to take a long, agonizing bus ride to his old upscale neighborhood. He walked the final few blocks to the sprawling suburban mansion we had once shared. It was the massive, ostentatious property he had proudly paraded around as the ultimate symbol of his supreme success. He stood on the edge of the manicured sidewalk, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his cheap coat, shivering in the cold breeze. He did not find a pristine, quiet estate. He found a massive, chaotic construction zone. Heavy steel barricades surrounded the property. I had officially seized the deed through the debt acquisition, and I had zero interest in keeping a house poisoned by his toxic memories. I had ordered the immediate total demolition of the entire estate. Harrison stood frozen on the concrete pavement, watching in absolute horror as a fleet of massive yellow excavators roared to life. The heavy iron claws swung forward violently, crashing into the grand columns of the front porch he had once boasted about. The beautiful bay windows shattered into a million pieces, raining glass down onto the driveway. The roof collapsed inward with a deafening, thunderous roar, sending a massive cloud of gray dust rising high into the clear blue sky. A large architectural rendering was posted on the chain-link fence right in front of where Harrison stood, trembling. It displayed a beautiful modern community center. The bold lettering announced that the site was being completely redeveloped into a fully funded philanthropic foundation to support low-income working-class students seeking higher education. It was a direct, calculated, and deeply personal insult to the vicious classism his family had proudly displayed for decades. The money that once funded his arrogant lifestyle was now going to educate the exact type of people he had always despised. Harrison watched the heavy machinery grind the luxurious marble floors and grand staircases into worthless, unrecognizable rubble. The deafening sound of the tearing metal and crushing stone mirrored the violent destruction of his own life. A suffocating, unbearable weight pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He looked at the dust settling over the ruins of his fake kingdom. In that agonizing, crystal-clear moment, the heavy fog of his lifelong narcissism finally lifted. He realized with devastating, irreversible certainty that he had not just lost a submissive wife. He had held a priceless, incredibly rare diamond in his hands for 5 agonizing years. He had possessed the absolute loyalty and sheer brilliance of a woman who could have conquered the entire world by his side. But because of his blind, pathetic arrogance and his desperate, toxic need to feel superior, he had thrown that flawless diamond directly into the dirt. Now the diamond was shining brighter than the sun, and he was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing, lonely silence of his own miserable, ruined existence. 6 months had passed since the spectacular, explosive collapse of my former life. The chaotic, deafening noise of that disastrous anniversary gala felt like a distant, hazy nightmare belonging to an entirely different lifetime. Tonight, the atmosphere inside my Tribeca penthouse was a perfect portrait of absolute, unshakable tranquility. Soft instrumental jazz floated smoothly through the expansive living space, weaving effortlessly between the warm, golden glow of the recessed lighting. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Manhattan skyline, transforming the relentless, aggressive energy of the city into a silent, beautiful backdrop. I was no longer the shrinking, invisible analyst hiding behind cheap, sensible sweaters. I was no longer wearing the heavy armor of a ruthless corporate executioner either. I wore a simple, elegant emerald green silk slip dress, my bare feet sinking comfortably into the plush Persian rug. The dark, ugly bruise that Harrison had violently imprinted on my cheekbone was completely gone, leaving behind flawless skin and a profoundly healed spirit. The raging internal war that had consumed my soul for 5 agonizing years was officially over. I had won. The private elevator chimed with a soft, melodic ring. The heavy mahogany doors parted to reveal the only 2 guests I had invited for dinner tonight. My father Alexander stepped into the elegant foyer, carrying a rare, exceptionally expensive bottle of vintage red wine. He had abandoned his grease-stained work boots for a pair of polished Italian loafers and a tailored navy blazer, though he still stubbornly refused to wear a restrictive necktie. His sharp, calculating Wall Street eyes completely softened the absolute second he looked at me. Beside him stood Donovan, holding the small, trusting hand of his young son. Donovan looked like a completely revitalized man. The heavy, suffocating exhaustion that used to weigh down his athletic frame during those toxic family dinners had entirely vanished. He radiated the calm, focused energy of a brilliant surgeon who had finally excised a malignant tumor from his own life. "Welcome home," I said, greeting them both with warm, genuine embraces. I knelt down to high-five Donovan's energetic son, who immediately ran off to explore the sprawling living room, completely safe and blissfully unaware of the absolute monsters he had narrowly escaped. Donovan handed me his coat with a relaxed, brilliant smile. "I cannot thank you enough for tonight, Stella," he said, his deep voice filled with profound, unwavering gratitude. "And I cannot thank you enough for the recommendation on my legal team." The divorce was finalized last week. I retained full sole physical and legal custody. Caroline did not even bother showing up to the final hearing. She is apparently too busy working double shifts at a terrible rundown diner in Queens, trying to pay off her mounting legal fees. I led them to the dining table. It was not a table set to intimidate or project false inherited wealth. There were no arrogant patriarchs demanding absolute worship, and no snide, insecure siblings measuring the financial cost of the silverware. It was just a beautifully roasted meal, exceptional wine, and the comforting company of people who fundamentally respected one another. We sat together, sharing rich stories that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate takeovers or fragile, shattered egos. My father laughed a deep, booming laugh as Donovan recounted a chaotic shift at the hospital. Alexander was completely fascinated by the sheer skill, intellect, and dedication required to literally save human hearts. There was no condescension here. There was no bigotry disguised as polite suburban conversation. Alexander looked at Donovan with the utmost respect, recognizing a fellow self-made man who had built his entire life on actual talent rather than fraudulent inheritance. We talked about the new philanthropic foundation I had officially launched. The educational center was already being constructed right on top of the crushed, pulverized ruins of Harrison's former suburban mansion. Donovan smiled broadly at the poetic justice of that development, knowing his son would grow up seeing that foundation thrive. As the dinner naturally wound down, Alexander stood up from his chair. He reached for his crystal wine glass, holding it high in the warm, ambient light. He looked at Donovan, then at the young boy playing happily near the sofa, and finally rested his proud, unwavering gaze entirely on me. To the strongest, most brilliant woman I know, my father announced, his voice vibrating with thick, undeniable emotion. I spent years watching you shrink yourself to fit into a world that did not deserve a single ounce of your presence. But you did not just break out of that suffocating cage, Stella. You completely dismantled it piece by piece and built a flawless empire from the scrap metal. To fierce independence, to unyielding self-respect, and to the family we actually choose. To the family we choose, Donovan echoed firmly, raising his glass and clinking it gently against mine. I raised my own glass and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the rich red wine. The taste was absolutely perfect. The heavy, crushing burden of pretending, of performing, of constantly enduring psychological abuse just to keep a fake peace had been permanently lifted from my shoulders. I excused myself from the table for a brief moment, leaving the two men deep in a cheerful, animated conversation about vintage car engines and pediatric medicine. I walked across the smooth hardwood floor and pushed open the heavy sliding glass door leading out to the expansive private balcony. The crisp, biting evening wind immediately whipped through my hair, but the sudden chill felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I walked right up to the thick glass railing and rested my hands against the cool, smooth surface. Hundreds of feet below me, the glowing, pulsing arteries of Manhattan traffic flowed endlessly through the concrete canyons. Millions of people were rushing through the city, fighting their own fierce battles, escaping their own invisible cages. I looked down at the spectacular, glittering chaos of the world below. I touched my fingertips lightly against the delicate, thin rim of my crystal wine glass. A slow, genuinely peaceful smile spread across my face. I no longer had to wear a suffocating mask of submissive mediocrity. I no longer had to bite my tongue and endure the vicious, toxic cruelty of people who viewed my existence as a charity project. True family is not a heavy, inescapable prison built on biological obligation or restrictive marriage certificates. Family is a safe sanctuary that inherently respects your boundaries, uplifts your spirit, and fiercely protects your fundamental value as a human being. I had systematically burned down the fake, arrogant empire that tried to bury me. I had confidently seized the reins of my $2 billion legacy. I had taken back my absolute, uncompromising freedom with my own two hands, cut to black. The story we just explored teaches us a profound lesson about self-worth and the true meaning of family. For years, the main character shrank her brilliant mind and suppressed her powerful presence just to appease a husband and his relatives whose entire identities were built on fragile arrogance and toxic classism. Many of us make this exact same mistake in our own lives. We dim our own light so we do not blind the deeply insecure people around us. We endure disrespect, emotional manipulation, and even outright abuse because we falsely believe that marriage or biological ties create an unbreakable bond that requires our endless personal sacrifice. This journey shatters that dangerous illusion entirely. Her ultimate triumph did not actually come from her massive trust fund or her ability to financially destroy her abusers. Her true victory was the realization that her personal dignity is absolutely non-negotiable. The most vital takeaway is that legal documents and shared last names do not give anyone a free pass to treat you like a disposable asset. A true family is not a heavy, inescapable cage where you are constantly judged and demeaned for your background. Instead, a genuine family is a safe sanctuary composed of people who respect your firm boundaries, protect your inner peace, and celebrate your authentic self without any toxic conditions. She proved that the ultimate revenge against narcissistic people is simply taking back your power and thriving completely without them. You never have to accept the table you were given if the people sitting there demand you eat the miserable scraps of their disrespect. You have the absolute power to stand up and build your own table. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic people to protect your own peace, please share your experience in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories.